What is up? Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. Hope everybody's having a wonderful day. We got a good one coming at you today from Company Man. Cedar Fair versus Six Flags. So, yeah, let's not waste any time. Let's go ahead and get into this.
Sponsored by Morning Brew. It's a daily newsletter that I've been reading every morning to keep me up to speed on business, finance, and tech. You can sign up for free by going to morningbrewdaily.com.
We'll just ignore the ads. Here we go.
Theme parks are pretty awesome, and two of the biggest, most well-known owners and operators of them are, of course, Cedar Fair and Six Flags. Both known for the roller coasters, water parks.
I love roller coasters myself. I hope you guys love roller
Throughout this
coasters.
video, you're going to see
If you don't like roller
companies
coasters,
follow
something's wrong with you.
remarkably
No, I'm just
similar
kidding.
paths
You may
with a few
be scared of
noticeable
heights or
differences.
something
We're going
crazy
to be
like that.
comparing 10
I won't say
different
that.
categories that I feel are meaningful in understanding their evolution and the differences between them. But first, I do want to point out that I have already made a video focusing entirely on Six Flags, so to avoid repeating things, this video is going to have a much greater emphasis on Cedar Fair, which is another great story. So for the first few comparisons,
Oh, okay, like
I think
Cedar
it would
Point.
be interesting
I've been to
try
Cedar Point
determine
in
which one is bigger.
Ohio,
When you combine the
I
amusement
believe.
parks and the water parks, Cedar Fair has 17 in total, covering about 4,500 acres that were visited by over 19 million people in 2021, while Six Flags operates 27 parks covering around 6,000 acres that were visited by over 27 million people in
10 more
2021.
parks.
All numbers that suggest Six Flags is significantly larger, but it should be mentioned that the visitors to Cedar Fair, on average, tend to spend more money while they're there. So once you combine the admission, the food, the merchandise, the games, and everything else, Cedar Fair is actually much more comparable. Looking at their total sales, I mean, it's pretty close. Six Flags usually is higher, but Cedar Fair has pulled ahead in certain years.
2020 was
Overall,
rough.
Six Flags is generally bigger, but I wouldn't be surprised if we saw that change.
Get her out of here.
To compare would be their international presence, which again is currently very similar between the two. Outside of the US, they each have one park in Canada, while Six Flags has two additional ones in Mexico, though historically Six Flags has had multiple parks in Europe, and up until they were canceled in early 2020, they had big plans to open some parks in China. Next up is
so COVID really messed up their big plans.
It can be a tricky question depending on how you look at it, but the roots of Cedar Fair go back long before Six Flags. This is where the naming can get confusing. The company that I've been talking about is called Cedar Fair, but their first theme park, and still the biggest one today, is called Cedar Point. It is in Sandusky, Ohio, on this peninsula stretching out into Lake Erie.
I've been there.
Strategically positioned almost directly between Cleveland and Toledo, but also only a few hours away from Detroit, Columbus, and Pittsburgh. Back in 1870, an immigrant from Germany named Louis Zistel built a bathhouse there. He would make money by renting bathing suits and by providing rides on his boat to the location. He then used that money to open a beer garden that had a dance floor. There's a lot that could be said about the development of the area around that time, but by the 1890s, Cedar Point was starting to transform from a recreational area into an amusement park, complete with rides. Like when they built their first roller coaster in 1892 called the Switchback Railway, that in their words stood an amazing 25 feet tall and reached an unbelievable top speed of 10 miles per hour. Before the end of the century, Cedar Point was facing some financial troubles.
I mean, I feel like that's a lot for
customers, leaving them
18 something. That's crazy to even think about. That's over 100 years ago.
That is when George Boakling came in and took over the company. He had made a lot of money in the real estate business and believed in the potential of the area enough to use that money to update and expand it. I'm talking about repainting and remodeling everything, building more roller coasters, and eventually gaining publicity from celebrity guests. I guess even President Taft took a trip to Cedar Point, giving them more credibility. Everything was going well until the 1930s. There were quite a few rises and falls here. In 1931, George Boakling died right near the beginning of the Great Depression, two things that were very harmful. The attendance fell, the whole place was more or less neglected for the next 25 years or so. There was talk about
can't be surprised there. I mean,
transforming it into something else.
Honestly, you can't really be surprised there with like the Great Depression, because like during the Great Depression, nobody was trying to spend money. Who's going to go to an amusement park? Like that just, it doesn't check up. It doesn't. Nah.
Similar to what happened 60 years earlier, some investors came in, bought the place, and again saw enough potential to invest millions of dollars into fixing it up and expanding it. I would almost say that we can call this the unofficial start of the modern-day Cedar Point. That was all in the 1950s, by the way, which you may notice was not long before the opening of the first Six Flags. And that is not a coincidence, because it all happened just after the opening of another theme park called Disneyland in 1955. The people behind Cedar Cedar Point and Six Flags saw how successful Disneyland was. It made
I
them
can never
realize how many
remember
people
how old
wanted to
Disney
go to
is.
theme parks, and they saw it as a promising opportunity. They realized that the families in Ohio or Texas
Some
would
of
have a
those
hard time
original
getting out to
Disney
Disneyland
characters
in
were a little
Anaheim,
creepy, though.
California.
I'll
So
be
these
honest.
new theme parks presented a much more practical, inexpensive option for them. Throughout the 1960s, both of these companies continued growing, trying to lure customers away from the new competitors that also saw opportunity in the markets. And by the 1970s, things had become insanely competitive. That's going to be the focus of my next comparison, because both of them were pressured to expand during this time, but they went about it in a much different way. Cedar Point raised money through a public stock offering and invested it into new rides and attractions, among them being the giant Ferris wheel, an IMAX cinema, and the Gemini roller coaster. Meanwhile, Six Flags was more concerned with opening or acquiring additional theme parks. By 1977, Six Flags operated parks in Arlington, Georgia, Missouri, Houston, and New Jersey, while Cedar Point still only had that one park in Sandusky. However, that did change the following year when Cedar Point bought a second park in Minnesota called Valley Fair. And that right there is where the naming confusion stems from, by the way. In the 1980s, the company was renamed Cedar Fair to reflect the two parks that they owned at the time. So from that point, Cedar Fair is the company, but Cedar Point is the name of their main park. And that was the start of many other acquisitions.
That's really
for Cedar
confusing,
Fair.
actually.
In the 1990s, they bought parks in Pennsylvania and Missouri, but a bit more notable, I would say, would be in 1997 when they bought Knott's Berry Farm in California. That one goes back to the 1920s, and I say it's notable for two reasons. One, because unlike their other parks that were located in much colder climates, Knott's Berry Farm was their first to operate through the entire year, providing a source of income outside of the summer months. And my other reason is tied to my next comparison, the characters. Knott's Berry Farm had already owned a license to the Peanuts characters, so with that purchase, Cedar Fair has since been able to utilize those characters in different ways. Also, in 2006, Cedar Fair made their biggest acquisition ever when they bought the Paramount Parks from CBS for $1.24 billion. That was a deal that included
big acquisition
in Ohio, Virginia, North Carolina, Toronto, and California. CBS was looking to sell them because they had just split from Viacom and they were looking to better focus on their TV channel and other media properties. Meanwhile, Cedar Fair was still looking to expand, so the deal seemed to make sense. And that was a deal that also included a license to use the Nickelodeon characters at their parks, but the license did expire a few years later. For Six Flags, a notable acquisition would be in 1984 when they bought Great America in Illinois from Marriott. Along with that deal, they obtained the rights to use the Warner Brothers Looney Tunes characters that they had already licensed to the park. In fact, those characters were such a hit for Six Flags that it motivated Warner Brothers to buy Six Flags in the early 1990s before reselling it a few years later. But when Warner sold it, Six Flags retained the rights to continue using their DC characters. As you might imagine, all of these acquisitions on both sides were causing them to go into debt, and that's going to be my next comparison because it's something that eventually became a troubling issue for both of them, but in somewhat different ways. Oddly enough, both companies were involved in a leveraged buyout in the 1980s, which certainly didn't help things, but in the 1990s, it became much more of an issue for Six Flags. It's a little complicated. Warner put some of their debt into it, and then they were bought by this company, Premier. My other video goes into more details about it, but my point here is throughout the 2000s, debt was really starting to hold them back. Massive interest payments were making it almost impossible for them to turn a profit. By 2004, they sold their European parks to raise money to put toward their debt, and by 2009, they filed for bankruptcy. Meanwhile, Cedar Fair has been a little more conservative and able to avoid bankruptcy, but it's still been an issue. In 2006, their debt went up by almost $1 billion, mostly from that deal with Paramount. It was poor timing too, because it was shortly before some bad economic factors that reduced attendance and contributed to the Six Flags bankruptcy as well.
We've talked about that before while watching other videos. The crash of like 08.
That these two companies had a major interaction with each
other. That was
a
horrible time for my family.
When Cedar Fair bought a theme park in Ohio from Six Flags for $165 million. It was a deal that I think tells so much about both of them. It was a park that goes back to the 1800s. It was originally called Geauga Lake. Well, in 1995, Premier
It doesn't even
bought
sound
the
like a
company
great
that
name
owned
for a
Geauga
park.
Lake. Then in 1998, bought Six Flags and rebranded all of their parks to use the Six Flags name. As part of that rebranding, Geauga Lake was renamed Six Flags Ohio. Then in 2001, they bought SeaWorld Ohio, combined it all into one thing that was now called Six Flags Worlds of Adventure. I hope everyone's following this so far because in 2004, Cedar Fair bought that that park, changed it back to the original name of Geauga Lake, made the SeaWorld part into a water park named Wild Water Kingdom, which I suppose none of it matters much because at this point it has all since closed down. But I say the story is telling because it perfectly represents a time period where these companies were headed in very different
That is definitely
directions.
super,
Just
super
the fact that
confusing.
Six Flags was looking to downsize while Cedar Fair was looking to grow. I mean, how often does that happen?
Super
Where Six
confusing.
Flags was willing to give up complete control of the Ohio market. It marks a rare time where Cedar Fair was consistently making higher profits than Six Flags. Six Flags had overextended themselves and were now pulling back a bit, and Cedar Fair, strangely, was just about to overextend themselves as well, though I'll admit to a lesser extent. I just think it's interesting because it's a deal that I don't think would have ever happened at any other point in time. Also, I should say, nothing ever took place, but in 2019, Six Flags did offer to buy Cedar Fair for $4 billion. Cedar Fair didn't want to do it, but I could see something like this happening one day. Overall, operating theme parks has been such an unstable business. It's the kind of thing where these two companies have been so competitive that they almost feel the need to take these huge risks just to keep up with each other, making big deals that put them further into debt, just hoping that the market will remain strong and they'll be able to keep up with it. But that's
And then
the
a
issue.
crisis
The market
comes.
for theme parks isn't stable. Things like a weaker economy or the pandemic or even bad weather has caused lower attendance at times, and whenever that happens, things become incredibly dangerous. They experience alarming drops in stock price and even a bankruptcy for Six Flags. Meanwhile, they're both still billions of dollars in debt, so I don't know, it's a crazy industry. Let me know in the comments, which one
Yeah,
do you
that's
prefer?
insane.
How do Cedar Fair and Six Flags compare to each other, and how do they
I haven't
compare
been to a
Disney
Six Flags in a
parks or
minute.
any other theme parks you've been to?
I
One thing
just
with the
recently
Disney
went
Channel,
to
this
Disney
video
World
did
for my
focus on
first
the
time
business
ever.
end
It's
rather than the
absolutely
parks
amazing.
themselves, so I'm curious how you compare
Uh,
them in that way.
the
And what do you
customer
see for
help
the
people,
future?
like
Is one of
the
them going to
help,
pull
the
way
people who worked
ahead?
there,
Are
they
they going
were
to combine with each
all the
other?
ones that
Or
I
could they
dealt
go
with were
bankrupt? I
super,
don't think
super
anyone
nice,
would
super,
surprise me at
super
this point.
helpful.
So any thoughts
I had a
on
really
Cedar
good
Fair,
experience at
Six
Disney.
Flags, or anything else I talked about in this video? Leave them in the comments. I'd like to hear what you have to say. Today's sponsor is
That was actually
Fleming
really
Brew,
good.
and
That was really good. I enjoyed that. I hope you guys did as well. And that's all for that.